All right, we'll take a look at 10.1. So the alternative, or another word for that is researcher's hypothesis, is a statement we are trying to find evidence to support. So now we'll practice identifying left tail, right tail, or two tail. So one thing to know is the null hypothesis is always going to be equal to. So this is a two-tailed test. And the parameter being tested, of course, is population mean. If the arrow is pointing to the right, this will be a right tail test. Parameter being tested is population proportion. Left tail test, arrow to the left. Population standard deviation. Now we're not going to do hypothesis testing for this parameter. We'll only do mean and proportion. And we'll practice writing these ourselves. So for students who first enrolled in two-year public institutions in a recent semester, the proportion who earned a bachelor's degree within 6 years is 393. So that's a statement of no change, no difference, no effect. So then the researcher comes along, the president of a certain college believes the proportion of students who enroll in her institution have a higher completion rate. So that's the key word. So we're testing the population proportion. The null hypothesis is always structured as equal to the standard at another institution was 393. And then the researcher believes the proportion has now increased from 393. For a type 1 error, you're always going to choose the one that says reject the null. So reject, fails to reject, reject. So we're already down to A or C. And then you always assume the null is true for type 1. So what does the null say? The null says percentage is equal to. So when in fact the proportion is greater than, when in fact the proportion is equal to. So that's a type 1. Then for a type 2, you always check the one that says fail to reject the null. So fail to reject, fail to reject, reject. So now we're down to A or B. And the second part is you always assume H1 is true. So H1 says the proportion is greater than. So proportion is greater than. That's how you explain away type 1, type 2 error. We can try again. Three years ago, the mean price of an existing family home was $243,799. Here's our researcher comes along, believes the existing price in her neighborhood is higher than that. So this time we're dealing with the mean. Always structure the null hypothesis with an equal to 243,799. And then the mean is greater than or higher. So this again will be a right tail test. For type 1, you always check the one that says reject. So we're down to A or D. And then for type 1, you always assume the null is true. So assume the null, the mean is 243. So when it is the true mean cost and greater than, so when it is the true mean, that is equal to. For a type 2 error, you always choose the one that says fail to reject. So we're down to A or B. And then you always assume the researcher is true here. So the mean is greater than. So greater than. All right, suppose the null hypothesis is not rejected. So when you do not reject, you always say there is not sufficient evidence. So we're down to either A or C. So state the conclusion based on the results. So 12 years ago, 12.8% of registered births were to teenage mothers. A sociologist believes this percentage has decreased since then. So if you do not reject, you're saying that there is not enough evidence to assume or to claim that this is true. All right, so that says the percentage of teenage mothers has decreased. So we're saying that that is the case. All right, so is not rejected again. There is not sufficient evidence to conclude the researcher's hypothesis. And this time the mean price has increased. So there's not enough evidence to conclude the mean price has increased, which will be D. No, there is, we're choosing, there is not, B on this one. So there is not sufficient, because we did not reject, to claim the researcher's hypothesis, that is, the mean price has increased. Has increased. All right, so the mean pressure required to open a certain valve is 6.4 psi. Due to changes in manufacturing process, the quality control manager feels that the average pressure has been reduced. Okay, the null hypothesis was not rejected. So again, when you do not reject the null, you say there is not sufficient evidence to claim that the pressure has been reduced. So there's not enough evidence to claim that the pressure of a certain valve has been reduced. Last one, state the conclusion based on the test, okay? So the mean cell phone bill is $49.41. A researcher suspects the mean is less than, so the null hypothesis is not. So again, if you do not reject, you always say there is not sufficient evidence to claim that the cell phone bill is less. So there's only one that says not, and it does say less than. So that's the one we go with. Okay, so I'll see you on the next video.